Hi, I'm Kelly Bourne, Executive Director of the Cyber Policy Center here at Stanford University, and wanted to go ahead and get us started today for our conversation about media literacy, which is one I've really been looking forward to as I am joined by three women that I have known and worked with over the years. Jennifer Kavanaugh from RAND's Countering Truth Decay initiative, Kristin Lord, who is the president and CEO of IREX, a global development and education organization operating in 100 countries around the world, which also runs a Learn to Dis-Earn media literacy program. And of course, Claire Wardle, who is the co-founder and director of First Draft, which recently launched a 2-week test messaging-based digital literacy course. So I'm looking forward to learning more from all of you about this. For background, for those who aren't as familiar with the Cyber Policy Center, all of our research and teaching focuses on improving the governance of digital technologies when it comes to questions of geopolitics, security, and democracy. So we are home to about a half dozen programs, and all of the work is really intended to inform the policy agenda for governments, tech platforms, civil society, and academia globally, again, when it comes to these questions of how best to govern digital technologies. Today's webinar is part of a series that we do every couple of weeks here at the center, always at 10 a.m. PST on Wednesdays. And as I said, today we're looking at media literacy for a number of reasons. I think as we have discussed quite often on these webinars, the information environment has changed dramatically in recent years. We know that in the past decade, newsroom revenues have declined something like 60%. And those revenues have not been recouped by digital native newsrooms, but instead often by the social media companies themselves. And at the same time, we see a big growth in the audience for online news. As of July of this year, 1 in 5 US adults reported getting their political news primarily through social media. This was the first time that we have seen social media news consumption surpassing radio, local, and cable TV. And of course, we know that there is some questionable content online that many of us are grappling with. And we know that platforms have tried quite a bit over the years to improve their content moderation practices to address this problem. But I think as we have seen with the tremendous amount of disinformation related to COVID, and again, around this US election cycle, that avenue has proven really challenging. And so I think the question that has arisen for many of us is, what are other angles to addressing this problem in addition to improving the platform's content moderation practices and helping to bolster newsrooms? And media literacy is obviously the sort of third leg in that potential stool, and looking at what citizens can do and how we can help bolster citizens' capacity to grapple with this new information environment. So that is the topic of today's conversation. And I wanted to start with Jennifer, and Jennifer, just ask you to talk through RAND's recent report on this, which was quite extensive, looking at the landscape of actors in this space and what the research has to say about what works, what doesn't work, what we know about impact. Would also love to hear from you what you see as the big knowledge gaps in this space, and any thoughts on policy implications for governments, for nonprofits, for tech companies, or others who are interested in this space. Then Claire, would love to turn to you to speak about your new project, how the rollout went, key research questions that First Draft is grappling with. I know you've been looking at a potential RCT to support your rollout. And then Kristin, wanted to turn to you to hear about what IREX is doing in this space, what studies you've done and what you've been learning in the field, especially because you are operating in more than 100 countries, to get a sense of how this is playing out differently in different geopolitical contexts. And then would also love to hear your thoughts on key research questions and policy recommendations. So I will start by turning it over to Jennifer, and then we'll make sure to save about 20 minutes at the end for Q&A if folks just want to go ahead and introduce questions into the Q&A box. All right, thanks all.
Great.
And Jennifer, I'll turn to you.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. I'm going to share some slides here. Before I start, can I just make sure that people can see the slides? Yep, okay, great. All right. So RAND's work, our initial report on media literacy, was really focused on trying to survey the field, do a little bit of synthesis, understand what we know and where the gaps are. and how we could move the field forward in terms of leveraging media literacy, which is a field that's existed for a long time, to tackle some of the challenges that we see in the disinformation space. So what I wanted to start with was thinking about the definition. What do we mean when we say media literacy? And I think there's a couple of things that we're referring to here. So the first is we can think of media literacy as a set of competencies. So I've listed here the ones that are usually named as falling under the media literacy rubric: the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, communicate, and produce media messages in a number of forms. And Renee Hobbs and others in this field have developed this definition and added additional competencies over time. Second, we can think about media literacy as an umbrella under which a number of other literacies fall. So I think sometimes we think about media literacy as news literacy, the ability to read news. That's really only a piece of it. There's many different types of literacy: science literacy, civics, digital literacy, the ability to navigate an online space, to find information, visual literacy, and many others. So it's important to understand that media literacy is a big tent under which all these other literacies fall. And finally, I think it's important to emphasize that media literacy is not like one skill that's separable from something else. It's really a way of thinking about information. It's an outlook, a worldview. And that's why I think part of the reason it's so hard to measure and to teach is that we're asking people to think about information in a whole different way, a more holistic way. So you see the box there on the left, on the right-hand side. I've tried to emphasize a couple of key things that I want to make sure, or want to emphasize that media literacy is not. It's not only about reading the news. It's not only fact-checking, and it's certainly not new. There's a lot of energy around media literacy now because of the incredible explosion of disinformation and the spotlight that's put on this challenge. But it's important to look back over the decades of work that already exists in this field, and that can help us to understand what we do know about media literacy and where the real gaps are. So, and the second question that I wanted to talk a little bit about is how well does media literacy work? And I think that Claire and Kristin are also going to talk a little bit on this topic. We do have past research that provides some evidence that media literacy can increase resiliency to disinformation, and it can change the way that individuals consume and create and share information. But there are a number of important limitations to kind of the body of work that we have and what we know about it. The first is that these studies that we have vary a lot significantly in how they define and measure media literacy competencies, and that makes it hard to aggregate a body of knowledge. If we want a body of knowledge that tells us how media literacy works, we'd like to have a number of different studies that tackle this with similar definitions, a common set of standards, and replicate those findings over time. That's like what we see in areas of hard sciences, where we like to see a whole body of research that helps us to understand what works and what doesn't. We'd also like to have studies that allow us to see which types of interventions work best, in what contexts, and with what types of teachers. We don't really have that in this case, partly because there are so many different ways of measuring and defining media literacy, but also because the media literacy competencies that we're talking about are really hard to measure. How do you measure someone's ability to analyze information or evaluate that information or create information? What's the standards? What's the rubric on which we assess individual skills? And there's a lot of work in this field trying to develop these sets of standards. But for teachers, partly because there are so many different types of standards and so many different sets of them, that can be an additional challenge. So there's a gap there in our understanding of the field, the body of evidence as a whole. A third, we know a lot more about how media literacy works in areas like public health, things about prevention of disease, eating disorders, and in violence prevention than we do about the news literacy piece. And that's partly because the focus has shifted over time. When the media literacy field first came into being, we weren't quite as concerned about disinformation online because online spaces either didn't exist or were not something that everyone was living in 24 hours a day. So that shift then means that we know a lot about, or we know more about how media literacy works in some fields than in others. And the one that we're most concerned about when we think about disinformation, we know a little bit less about, We also have more evidence about short-term outcomes than long-term outcomes. So ideally, we'd be able to follow people over time and say, well, this class that this person took in high school, you can see those effects lasting over their lifetime. Most of the studies we have are shorter term. Does this last over a couple weeks or a couple of months? And finally, most of the studies that we have don't provide us with the same kind of causal evidence base that we'd really like to have in the ideal world. And that would be something like a randomized control trial, which I think Claire will talk a little bit about how she might use one. But that would be the ideal. That's the kind of gold standard in terms of understanding the effects of research, because it allows us to make causal arguments. This affected this, and we can make that direct connection. In the education space, that's really hard to do because it's hard to control all those other variables and make sure you have common samples on both sides. So we do have some evidence that it works. But there are pockets of gaps that make it hard for us then to leverage that in the most effective way. And so in thinking about what research that we need, where are the gaps? What are things that we as a research community might try to do and things that we at RAND are focused on? The first is getting that common set of standards, making sure we have a common definition that everyone is agreeing to, and a set of standards or sets of standards that everyone agrees are kind of the right ones, or at least a useful set of standards for moving forward now. The second is building this causal research base that will allow us to say something about not just does media literacy work, but how, when, and what types. And to compare across types of media literacy to say which types work best in which contexts. This would ideally include longitudinal analysis focused on news-related literacy, so allow us to kind of isolate that specific type of work. And then think about the effects of teachers, the characteristics of teachers, the characteristics of students. So we really get a sense of what are the variables that affect the impact that media literacy education can have. The other things that we need are thinking about a bridge between research and practice. So it's great for us to research things and to get interesting research findings, but unless we're getting that into the hands of practitioners, then there's a limit to the value of that research. And so I think it's really important, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, to think about how we can leverage what we learn in research to provide actionable tools for teachers, whether that's new curricula or whether that's tools and criteria that allow them to pick the specific set of curricular materials that are going to be most useful in their classrooms. And the final challenge, which I think is kind of the elephant in the room that no one's talking about, is the challenge of reaching adult populations. We focus a lot of our attention on building media literacy programs for schools, whether that's K through 12 schools or colleges. But once people are out of school, how do you reach them? We have millions of adults who use social media every day who don't have these skills, and we don't have a good way to reach them. So thinking about the model that we might use to get media literacy into the hands of the broader population is a really important question that I think is under addressed currently, that needs to be a greater focus. So thinking forward, like what can policymakers do? What can corporations do? What can social media platforms do? What can researchers do? I think there's a couple of key things. The first is, before we there's some talk that the role of the government here should be to issue media literacy standards or requirements. Until we know more about what works and where it works, I think that that's maybe not the best path. And maybe the government isn't the best actor to be legislating from top down, just given the diversity in school contexts, political contexts. The type of media literacy education that works in a given school or a given classroom is likely to be pretty specific. And so I think the better approach would be investing in this type of research that would allow us to answer these questions so that we can make sure that the best possible resources are getting into individual classrooms. I think social media companies do have a role to play here, and I think it could be a couple of things. One is they could be a valuable source for providing various resources for teachers, kind of a central hub where teachers know they could go to get that information. They can also serve as a source of data so that teachers could and researchers could use the data that we know social media companies have to better understand the effects of media literacy outcomes. RAND's research suggests that teacher training and support will be really important. We've done some surveys of teachers that suggest that in the areas of media and civic literacy, they're basically creating their own materials a lot of times. They don't have a lot of sense of where to go for those resources, and they don't have a lot of support in that area. So I think investing here could have real positive externalities, since the teachers are the vehicle that's ultimately getting to the students. And finally, I think the one thing that we really emphasize here in our report is this collaboration and participation of multiple actors across different fields. That would mean educators, media, government, social media, researchers, and this type of coordination could be really important. And I know that the National Media Literacy Alliance is really working in this direction as well, trying to build this broad-based, diverse coalition that can help to move some of these principles, some of these research agendas, some of these investments forward to really make sure that we're leveraging media literacy, which is a really valuable set of resources, to its best possible extent. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to my co-panelists.
Great, thanks so much, Jennifer. And Claire, do you want to jump in and just speak a little bit to how you are defining and thinking about and deploying media literacy and the sort of rationale or thought process that informed how you designed your programs?
Yeah, so I've just got a couple of visuals so it's easier to make sense. But just very quickly, so my name is Claire Wardle. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Kelly. And for people who don't know us, we are a nonprofit. We've been around for about 5 years, and we were set up just actually to train journalists. So we have got a lot of experience of training journalists in these things. And then in the last year, we realized that was there anything we could take from our learnings from training journalists to apply to the public? And as you can imagine, training journalists are the worst people to train because A, they think they know everything, and B, they've got absolutely no time. So it did force us to think about ways to be innovative around training, because most of the training I'm in, people are just crossing my hands. And I'm actually teaching some undergraduates this semester, and it's such a joy because they're so perky and keen and they do the reading. But anyway, I wanted to give you some background of where we came from with all of this. And so earlier in the year, we're actually working with a number of community organizations this year. Again, this is new for us. So organizations like Color of Change, United We Dream, communities who are representing those who are more likely to be targeted with disinformation. So Latinx communities, communities of color. And so we recognized that we wanted to reach these communities, but we weren't going to get them on webinars. Nobody had any time. How were we going to reach people quickly? And around the time, we just thought, hang on, nobody's really using mobile effectively. We do a lot of work in other countries, and in places like Brazil and India, it's all on WhatsApp. It's all mobile only. And so we're like, okay, this is silly. Why are we not thinking about the same kind of approaches in the US? So we came up with a 14-day SMS course. And every day you sign up on a platform. You can sign up just with a text message number, cell phone number, and you can say, I would like to get this at 10 a.m. or 6 p.m. or wherever you think you might have some time in the day. And every day at that time, a nugget of content basically comes onto your phone. And what we know is we're still terrible at looking at those notifications. Like, it's one of those formats that actually you still have very, very high open rates. So this is a terrible graphic, so I apologize, but I wanted to show a little bit of the kind of things that we do. So the first day is just definitions. What's the difference between mis and disinformation? Day 2, motivations. Why do people do this? I'm amazed how people go, well, who would do it in the first place, Claire? And you're like, well, some people do it for financial, some people do it for political. Day 3, right up there, we talk about emotions. We talk about why people need to be emotionally skeptical. We talk about pre-bunking versus debunking. We talk about the ABCs of disinformation. So actors, behaviors, content. Why is it that we can't just focus on debunking content, but we need to talk about the A's and B's? Because many of you probably know this, I'm a communications scholar originally. Third person effect is the biggest problem here, which is nobody thinks that they are affected by misinformation, but they think everybody else is. So we try to leverage that through this, which is, we know you don't need this training, but hopefully you can talk to your uncles and aunties and grandmas about this. So that was kind of how we tried to frame it. We talked about tactics and techniques. We talked about media manipulation. And then we got into verification. So we are known as a verification nonprofit. We help newsrooms verify content, but we switched everything around because we did a training needs assessment with these communities who were like, no, I want to know why people are affected by this. I want to know what I can do with my communities. And the verification piece, which journalists want, was nowhere to be seen. So we put that towards the end. And that day 13 is difficult conversations, because again, what we heard from people was, how do I talk to my uncle who is sharing conspiratorial content on the family email listserv. Like, how do I talk to him? I'm not talking to my dad because he supports Trump and I don't. I mean, this is what kept coming through when people said, how do I deal with that? So all of this is included in it, but they're basically nuggets of content. It's like the equivalent of just one text message script. You don't really have to scroll. It's got lots of emojis in it. It looks like this. It was designed in a way to be engaging, colorful. It could be shared and forwarded if people wanted to. And so that's really how it's been designed. And we've done it in English and Spanish. So here are the links if anybody's interested. We're about to start a social media promotion campaign to try and reach as many people as possible. But I think there's a number of things I want to talk about based on what Jennifer was saying. But the challenge for an organization like First Draft is we don't have a huge public presence. So what we like to think about is how can we give this material to other gatekeepers? So the reason we used to only work with newsrooms was as the idea with the newsrooms were the gatekeepers. But now it's how do we get this in the hands of community organizers? How do we get this into the hands of people who moderate large mums groups on Facebook? We've just started this week working with Spotify because they're very concerned about citizen podcasters who have got no idea how to do this. So what we're trying to think about from a literary perspective is how can we give tools to other people to be those trainers? So in our world, we talk a lot about train the trainers. What does train the trainers look like in this environment where we're trying to reach lots of different communities in different ways, not in that formal sense, and we don't have time to do it in the formal sense? Are there other ways that we can do this? So to Kelly's point, the challenge is, I don't know whether this has worked. We've got some lovely qualitative feedback that we have sent to the funders, but has this actually moved the needle? I don't know. Has this actually been something that people are sharing with their communities? Are they talking to their friends and family about this? That to me is the question. And we spoke to NYU, who are currently doing a lot of randomly controlled trials around media literacy content particularly. And, you know, we're trying to fundraise to find the money to do that. But this is kind of crying out for, does this work? And we can do, we've got some pre and post surveys, but what we really want to do, to Jennifer's point, is the dream was that we would have done this in September and been rolling out real world misinformation that's happening right now. We're seeing a ton of misinformation every single day. My dream would have been to see whether or not the people who went through this are better at spotting it than other people. Did they find effective ways to talk to their friends and family about all of this? So I don't know, but the research questions here are, how long term is it? And it's not just about the effects on the person who's taken the course. Are they able to use this and have effects on other people as well? And to Kelly's point, 100%, or Jennifer's point about different age groups, is that because we've always worked with journalists, we've always worked with non-high school, kind of communities. And the question is, does this work if, and actually, interestingly, lots of the qualitative feedback has been like, that was great, Claire, and I sent it immediately to my mum. So even as like that, just as a kind of a case in point, is that people want a sense of self-efficacy right now. They know there's a problem. And part of the reason we're in this problem is the self-efficacy feeling they're getting from sharing false information, but they don't realize it. So, when we talk about why conspiracy theory is so compelling, because people feel like their lives are out of control. And a lot of conspiracies are simple, powerful narratives that make people feel a sense of explanation for why their lives have turned upside down. So how do we tap into that need people have right now to feel like they're doing something to help their communities with information disorder? And I don't think we've really tapped into that feeling. It's been very much, how can we teach people as opposed to how can we give them the tools? And I don't want to go on very long, but I just wanted to talk about one other teaching piece, because I think it's important, is that this year we've been running a lot of simulations, crisis simulations with journalists. And unbelievably, one of the people who came in February from Scientific American wrote this up yesterday. It was published. And the reason I want to talk about it is because in that simulation, her group decided to go rogue. So normally we run this simulation with journalists and we basically play out a disinformation campaign in a virtual environment where there's a virtual Slack, a virtual Facebook, a virtual Twitter, and the journalists have to make decisions about, should I report on this? How would I report on this? How would I write the tweet? And everybody's very polite and they do their jobs properly. This journalist came in and was like, screw that, I'm going to go rogue and I'm going to be the troll. And they basically just caused absolute carnage in this simulation. But what she wrote about here, I think, gets to so much here. playing the bad guy showed me how the design of platforms is geared towards controlling minds, not expanding them. I'd known this, but now I felt why journalism couldn't compete against influence operations on the high-speed battlefield of social media by taking up the same arms as the outrage machine we would become them. And so what I read that yesterday, and it just reminded me of how can we get at the emotional part of this? How can we make people feel things when we're doing this kind of literacy training? And I think there's a fear about putting people in simulations, or, I mean, some of the best things like the bad news game that came out of Cambridge University, where people had to play the troll. I think, you know, and actually the research there showed that it worked, but I think we have to be much more innovative about the ways that we think about our training to tap into the feelings that people are having. And I worry that too much of what we do is based on this idea that people have a rational relationship to information. They don't, they have an emotional one. And I don't necessarily think that all of our materials get at that in a way that people feel something when they go through this. So I'm excited for the conversation. If anybody's interested in any of this, then I'm just Claire at firstdraftnews.com. But yeah, we've got a lot of work to do. And to Jennifer's point, we just need to research everything we can around this. So thank you. I will stop sharing my screen.
Claire, thank you. And if you don't mind putting a couple of those links in the chat box for the audience, I think that would be very, very helpful also, because we end up having a lot of people watch these online later and might want to be able to grab those. And also it's interesting seeing that last quote. I don't know if you had read Peter Pomerantsev's book, Nothing is True and Anything is Possible, but it very much, you know, makes you think of this question of, is it specific facts that are being eroded or just the general confidence in, you know, reality? Kristin, would love to turn to you now to understand your experience and also to hear more about the sort of international perspective, because I think, Claire, most of your efforts to date have been domestic in the US on this front. Is that right? Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much, Kelly and the Cyber Policy Center for hosting, and to the other panelists for giving a great overview. I agree with everything that's been said. I'd also like to step back for just a second. I'll talk a little bit about some of IREX's research that we've done that shows the impact we've had. I want to be clear that we're proud of this work. We're not satisfied with it. I think we need to do a lot more iteration and testing to get the kind of results we'd all like. I do want to pull back for just a second, though, and say what I'd like to leave you with. I'd like to leave you with the idea that, first of all, media literacy is a critical part of a multifaceted strategy with regulation, with what the tech platforms do. It's not a silver bullet, but there's so much more we need to do in order to really understand how to scale up media literacy work, and also to know what works best. And so that's why this conversation today is so important. So I'm going to skip through here some of why this threat is so important and the dimensions of it. I think the audience is probably familiar with some of these concepts. We're just really fighting our own brains when we're talking about media literacy, because there is a strong desire that is hardwired to share things that are salacious or threatening or interesting. And this is just an example of how the difference between spreads of conspiracy theorists and spreads of actual information and content on CDC WHO website. I like to think about the response to disinformation as being a three-legged stool. There should be a look at government regulation, there's a look at what the tech platforms response, but we also have to look at the citizen resilient side of this. And the reason for that is that when we live in free societies, as we're fortunate to do, there's no way that I can see that we can be successful unless we look at the information consumer side of the equation. Basically, the tech platforms are playing a cat and mouse game where there are some big, powerful cats, to be sure, but there are about 1 billion mice, and there are laws protecting the mice running rampant around. So when the cost of producing this information is basically zero, we really have to work on the citizen side, or else I don't see how we can really make gains and deal with the threats that were mentioned. So let me just talk a little bit what IREX has been doing over the past several years. Our work, which we call Learn to Discern, started in Ukraine. And we actually started working with adult audiences, and we started working with adult audiences through libraries. And we did this for very natural reasons. Our staff in Ukraine were very organically hearing a lot of concerns from older users of the libraries. This is in more than 1,000 communities, that older adults were being just overwhelmed with mainly Russian propaganda, disinformation. They didn't know how to filter it, and people were really seeing this as a threat to the emerging democracy of Ukraine. And so this is where we first started doing this work. But since then, we've been refining it. We've been working with different audiences. We've been working through different platforms and in many different countries as well. So by now, we are actually doing this work in roughly a dozen countries, a little more. In some cases, like Ukraine, it's quite systematic. We're now in 656 schools in a curriculum that is integrated throughout the curriculum, not just a separate module on media literacy. We are working through libraries. We are working in Indonesia through social media. We are working through youth and mother peer trainers. So we're really experimenting with a lot of different modalities and a lot of different platforms. We also would love to have really systematic, rigorous research about what works best with which audiences and for which desired outcome. And just a few words about the curriculum. The curriculum is, of course, meant to help people analyze media and news, fact check, recognize bias, recognize who owns this media outlet. For instance, there are many parts of the world where media news outlets are owned by oligarchs and they have political and economic agendas, and knowing who owns a media outlet is a very important piece of information. We also work on the emotional manipulation side, getting people to recognize when they are being emotionally manipulated and step away rather than just sharing, getting people to ask questions. Why is this being shared with me? Why is this evoking this emotional response in me? Should I think before I share? We find these are things that people can learn. And also when people learn their own innate biases about sharing information and why we react the way that we do, we notice that it empowers the individual. It gets at that issue of self-efficacy that Claire was talking about, and that people who feel very overwhelmed by the information environment feel a greater sense of control and also more responsibility about how they share information. So in terms of reaching audiences, we have worked with individuals and target groups, both through in-person, virtual, and online skill building courses. Some of them are in person, some are online. Often they work through trust networks, mothers, youth, peer groups, and so on. We've worked with mass publics. We've actually done television spots in countries like Ukraine or Georgia where we've reached millions. I'll show you a picture in just a second, usually using some humor, like people looking at labels on cereal boxes and saying, you wouldn't put garbage in your body without reading the label. Why are you sharing garbage without looking at what's inside? And then also we've worked a lot through institutions, schools, libraries, news organizations, and so on. A few examples just to give you a taste of what we're doing in Jordan and also in Tunisia. We've been working through peer networks. In Ukraine, as I mentioned, we're working through the formal school system with the Ministry of Education. Georgia, Ukraine, through public service announcements, as well as some of these other modalities. Indonesia, we've really been experimenting with online games and social media with a 90,000 visitor per week average. And then in Ukraine, our team has been working on this very verified online course. We've been partnering with coffee shops because this is where people often consume news information. There are little nuggets of courses, modeling Claire's, but a little bit longer, maybe a couple minutes. And there are some cases there are 5 or 6. So we had 29,000 people just voluntarily register and 8,513 complete, which for any of you who know online education, that's actually a really strong demand signal. That's a crazy high completion rate. And it gives us some hope that people want this information. They want to have control over their information environment. Let's talk a little bit about evidence. We do this is not based on self-reports. This is based on independent assessments before and after training for the most part. So in Ukraine, we see that students were twice as likely to detect hate speech after the training, 18% better at identifying fake news stories. And then you see with adult learners, we had not quite as good results, but they were notable. This was earlier, though. I think our record is getting better as we go. And then you can see our results in Jordan, which have been getting higher and higher. The 97% improvement in critically analyzing health article, I got that data this week, so that's pretty fresh. You can see these are some of our results in Serbia, and this gives you a sense of the kind of information that we're actually training for. And when we're talking about the ability to analyze media, we're talking about what's the point of view, what's the agenda, who owns this, are there biases that you can identify in the article? These are learnable skills, and we see that people can be taught how to gain these skills. What really matters, of course, is whether these skills last. So this particular impact study was done a year and a half after the training. These were with people compared to a control group a year and a half after they'd had the training. And you can see that there is a statistically significant improvement even a year and a half after the training compared to a control group in Ukraine. This is a long study. It's all on our website. Happy to answer any questions. So let me just quickly talk about the challenges. One is getting to scale. Yeah, it's great we're reaching 90,000 people a week in Indonesia. There are a billion people close to a billion people in Indonesia. It's great that we're reaching people in the United States, more than 300 million people in the United States. So reaching scale and reaching different audiences, I think it's a challenge. Staying relevant is a challenge. People right now, I think, really want this information, but our teams have to work super hard to update the curriculum all the time and have news stories that catch people's interest and are also showing a diverse set of viewpoints so they see that disinformation isn't only coming from one source. An additional challenge is to stay apolitical, especially if disinformation is more coming from one group of people or partisan affiliated groups than others. We really have to work on overdrive to do that. And then just to the other speakers' points, reaching diverse audiences, how you reach young people in an urban area versus a rural area, how you reach women, how you reach older audiences. There's no one size fits all approach here, and we need to know a lot more about how to do this. In order to be successful, I think we need to integrate responses with regulation, tech, and the citizen responses. We need high-level commitment. Little NGOs like us, we're not that little, and we can't do this alone. It has to be a globally coordinated approach, and we actually need long-term solutions, but we really, really need better research and data. So here are some things that I wanted to mention for research gaps and questions. First, what types of interventions are most effective and also most cost effective? If we don't look at cost effectiveness, we can't get to scale. And how do those approaches change based on who we're trying to reach and the context that they're living in? How can we sustain attention to building and maintaining media literacy skills over time? So not just when there's an election. And how do we address this in societies where, on the one hand, there's a clear external actor with a lot of resources, or in other cases, it's just how our brains work all day, every day, but there's no real sense of urgency or threat. What audiences should interventions prioritize? We talked about that. How can human-centered approaches play a role in a more comprehensive approach? And the last thing I'll mention is how many citizens have to have improved information consumption skills to have a society-wide impact. And the way I put this sometimes is when we're talking about media literacy, what's the equivalent of herd immunity? We're not obviously going to improve or make perfect every citizen in society, but what's the threshold we need to get over to really make a difference and be able to have a more balanced civic dialogue? So I'll leave it at that. I know we have lots of questions, and so Kelly, I will turn it back to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kristin, and everyone here. So one of the questions I want to get to first is, Kristin, you're in your list of questions, this one about audience. And this is one that I have often wondered about over the years. Do we go for the most extreme, hard to reach cases? Do we go for the sort of more moderate middle? And this was brought up by one of the attendees as well, where they essentially asked a question that I think of as the sort of preaching to the choir question. They are framing it here as, when you have misinformation or fake news in the title, it doesn't attract the problem audience, it tends to attract people like those of us on this call who are predisposed to want higher quality content. And so how do we overcome that? In this particular comment, they've noted that they sometimes disguise the purpose of the education and don't call it sort of fake news training or media literacy training. I have seen, and I'll note one other possibility that was interesting, and one that, I guess I would take a step back and say there are three main problems that I've struggled with in this space. It's the preaching to the choir one, which Chris in the audience articulates. It's the how do we get to scale one, which you've all sort of spoken to. And then it's this question of motivated reasoning, which is, sort of related to the preaching to the choir one, but, how do you get away from some of these behavioral tendencies that are just common in humans? And so I think this question around preaching to the audience or preaching to the choir, and one way that I've seen folks get around this, and David Rand from MIT brought this up in a call we did with him recently, is just how do we deploy media literacy through the platforms? And then you get away from the preaching to the choir argument and can get, to a much larger audience. And so, yeah, we'd be curious to hear, A, how all of you think about this preaching to the choir problem, and then B, what attempts you have or success you have had with trying to get this deployed through social media platforms.
I'd be happy to take a crack at that if you need someone to go first, Kelly. It's a great question, and I think we have to acknowledge that we won't reach everybody. I think that's part of it, but I do think we can reach more than the choir, and there are a couple of ways to think about this. One is to think about it's not the message, it's the messenger. Who are the trusted connectors who can get people to come to this kind of training with an open mind, and how do you actually engage content that speaks to those people? For instance, this is why we're working through Mothers in Jordan, because a lot of the worry that people have there is about young people being reached by extremist content and speaking to grievances, and then sort of manipulating the emotional appeal of that in order to recruit people and so on. Well, who are people who can, and so if you just came in, you're an American group and you say, I'm here to counter extremist messaging, write you off. You're not from my community. I don't care about your agenda. Doesn't matter to me. If though, mothers go in and say, look, this isn't, sure, maybe it has that application, but you will have more control over everything you consume, whether it's about people trying to sell you products or politicians trying to sell you a load of good, or your friends just misleading you inadvertently. You can have control. Mothers are trusted. And so we found that working through trusted messengers is having an impact. Now, I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done in order to figure out what's the audience and what's the trusted venue. And the last thing I'll say on this, Kelly, is I think there's a long-term strategy and a sort of a short-term strategy. The long-term strategy is just to get this into every school so that people have this their whole lives as a foundation. But I also think we need to talk about trigger events. And I've thought about the need to have, I don't know, you want to call it tiger teams or critical response teams, where if there is an election or other high profile events where we know disinformation escalates, that they can go in, or the coronavirus pandemic would be another.
Great, thank you, Kristin. Any other thoughts, Jennifer or Claire, on this sort of preaching to the choir question?
Yeah, so I guess one thing I would add is I think when we think about media literacy, as Kristin mentioned, one application is disinformation, but I think this goes back to what I said about just media literacy training being about worldview and outlook and thinking about ways we consume information. Certainly media literacy skills are useful in countering disinformation messages, but they're also useful just in navigating the online information space, finding what you're looking for, knowing how to create information. And so we're thinking about, our report really did focus on the K-12 audience. So I think there's two things there. The first is young people really like the creation side. And so making sure the creation side is a big piece of it can be a way to get them interested and involved. And then the rest of the skills can kind of be, snuck in with the, sneaking the vegetable in with the cheese or whatever metaphor you want to use. And the second is, media literacy doesn't have to be like a standalone course. Like in a school context, media literacy can be something that's integrated into every class. So in science class, in history class, in English is kind of an obvious one, in math. And so in that sense, like you're learning the skills in the context in which you're actually going to be applying them. And so you're getting all the tools and techniques that you might need to distinguish between true and false information, identify conspiracies, protect yourself from trolls and other types of online nefarious actors, but you're not getting it in kind of the media literacy bundle. And that I think gets around, I saw there was a question in there about like, making sure parents are on board. Well, if it's just part of the way you're taught your other subjects, then it's not necessarily something that's going to raise controversy or raise red flags for anyone. And it also helps you navigate that political context, because then you're not forced to say, okay, let's look at the newspaper and decide what's a good news source and a bad news source. You're actually teaching these skills, and I mean, everything's politicized today, but you're teaching them in a less political context, most likely.
Yeah, just very, very quickly. I mean, we called our course Protection from Deception, because all the research that nobody wants to be manipulated. And I think exactly to Jennifer's point, showing people that this is, for example, we teach verification by saying, if you're on a dating site, this is how you verify that you're not being catfished. Like, how do we find other ways? And like, that's really useful for me. But I would also say there's this sense that, oh, this is like preaching to the left, and this is an asymmetrical battlefield, which yes, to a certain extent, but there's a ton of people on the right who believe that there's a lot of stuff coming from the left. Like, I think we also have to talk to that. And I would love to see a way that we can get children bringing this into their homes. Like, that for me is the key here, which is it's not left or right. It's how can they spark those conversations and basically say, this kind of content is dividing families. We know that it is. And so is there a way to train young people up to be the people who go back? But in every community, it's different. So I think to Kristin's point about mums, or, we talk a lot with Black communities who quite rightly are very, very concerned about vaccines in their communities because of the history of the Tuskegee experiment. How do we work with barbershop owners? How do we think about faith as a way to, how do we work with church groups? How do we work with religious leaders? I mean, I just think that we haven't necessarily considered ways to reach as many people as possible. Although I have to say, Kristin, like, I look at your numbers and I am amazed. It's incredible to see how many people you're reaching.
Yeah, thank you all for that. This is a question in this space that has stumped me for a while. Another question that came up from the audience was this question is, does the very nature of the disinformation challenge just sort of challenge the core tenets of media literacy? And one of the things that I had found most interesting, it also relates to the scale piece, was a study that was done, and I believe it was by MIT, that had deployed media literacy trainings through social media companies. And so I'm not sure exactly how they had structured the nature of this deal where they could A/B test media literacy trainings. And what was fascinating about this study was that it didn't go straight to the heart each time of particular disinformation, but instead deployed at least two different approaches. One was like a traditional sort of 7-point media literacy program where they sort of walked you through the sort of fundamental tenets of how you understand and sort of analyze news. And then the other that they tested was simply a prompt that would come up in people's news feeds that would say, do you think it's important that you and others, share high quality news or something like that? And they found that those were actually sort of equal in their efficacy, and that what appeared to be most important was just in some way nudging people to think about quality before they shared. And so I guess my question for all of you is, how much have you experimented with different approaches to media literacy? And Kristin, you spoke to this a bit in your remarks, but not just in sort of the vehicle of who is delivering it, but the actual content that's being delivered. And Claire, it sounded like you were interested in some experimentation there as well. And have you found, marked differences in the types of content that's being delivered? Or is it, as this study seemed to suggest, enough to just nudge people to think about this as an important consideration before sharing?
Well, I'll just very quickly say that the work by people like Nathan Matthias, who've looked at nudge psychology or friction. It's the number one piece of research that seems to have the most impact. And that goes back to, actually, people are better at this than we give them credit for. It's just that they're also, you know, this technology is designed to not give us the space to think. But the minute you remind people to do it, that's what happens. I mean, I think we didn't really answer your question, Kelly, about working with platforms. Facebook back in 2017 we did like 7 top tips for spotting stuff. By the time the research came out, it was kind of like 2020, but we're doing research now on audience responses to labels on platforms. And I think it's very easy for us to be like, well, the more contextual labels we get, that's good for the ecosystem. It will surprise nobody on this call to learn that people on the left absolutely love those labels. People on the right have a very, very visceral, passionate response to those labels, and it's driving down trust more generally in terms of these information flows. So we also have to be very careful about the types of things that those of us who work in the quality information space kind of instinctively feel like, this is a good thing, like 10 top tips. I'm glad that Facebook is rolling it out. But I think we also have to be very, very careful about what some of those unintended consequences might be.
Yeah, I think we saw the same thing with fact-checking studies, where a lot of things that you sort of have a knee-jerk reaction to thinking are going to be helpful may not only not help, but actually make things worse. And I think it really speaks to the importance of testing. Anything others would add here?
I'm happy to weigh in here, Kelly. I mean, I think I try to give you a sense of the range of things we're trying. I mean, in Ukraine, that's sort of the gold standard where, exactly as the panelists were talking about, the Ministry of Education has committed to work with us, where media literacy is woven through every single subject, art, science, history, and there's that approach. We are also doing these little mini things on social media. We're doing these little mini courses that are only a couple of minutes. And we get different results, and all of them are positive in different ways. But what's really missing in the entire field are these kind of really rigorous studies that allow us to compare apples and apples when we are working with the same population over a similar time period, and we have basically a controlled study. How much is enough? How much training actually changes behavior, and which specific kinds of behavior? I mean, I just find the research on this woefully inadequate. And so one of the things I know I've talked to you about, Kelly, is how can we really get attention of funders and philanthropists to say that, look, these interventions have huge potential. They're very low cost, they're very long-term, but we don't have the data we need to make good decisions right now to invest those resources well. So there is little more impact. There's a little more impactful thing that you could do right now than to support this kind of research, in my book.
I think it's a great point. And actually before this call, and I'll send it to you, Kristin, but I was doing some research on, you know, who has funded in the news literacy space and who are the primary grantees. And it is a surprise, given how much conversation there is about disinformation and about media literacy, how little has gone into this space. You know, obviously a few like Stony Brook Foundation, the News Literacy Project, Pointer, and to an extent, Common Sense Media have all been, you know, on the receiving end of funding here, but a surprisingly small group. Although, Jennifer, to your earlier point, it may also be that no one can even agree on what to call this and whether I should be looking for funding for news literacy or media literacy or digital literacy. And so there are, I think, a lot of things that complicate any kind of research into this space, even who the players are and what they're up to, because we're all using such different language and defining this so differently. So I have 3 very easy questions, which is always delightful, and then time for if there are any questions from the audience, any last questions. We have a couple of minutes for that, but I'll go through these easy ones first as we wait to see if there's anything else we need to address. So learn to discern trainings in the US, do they exist, Kristin?
Yes, they do.
Can you put a link up to that in the chat box for folks so that they're able to find
I
them?
have members on my team who I think are on this call who I hope will send me a link so we can put it up, and I will try and do some rapid Googling in the meantime. It's been very small. We've done some tests in Arizona and in Connecticut. We've also partnered with Great Courses, which actually hired us to design a media literacy course for older adults. And so we have some impact data from that, but it's small compared to the market. But I will see if we can put that in the chat. Just give me a sec.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. It looks like a couple of these other questions were addressed. So we have a couple more minutes, and then I want to turn to next steps and the webinars that we have coming up. So I'll do those announcements in a moment. but would love to just hear any last thoughts from each of you. You know, we get a number of academics and nonprofits and funders on these calls and in the audience, and so would just love to hear any last thoughts from each of you on, you know, what are the big priorities for the field moving forward. Kristin, it sounds like from your perspective, you know, research and funding, both really critical here, but other thoughts from you, and then we'll turn to Jennifer and then Claire, since that's the order you show up for me.
Yeah, I think we have to get rid of the fragmentation. I mean, what you've heard here from people like Claire and what I presented, I mean, it's good work, but, you know, we all have relatively small pots of money. There aren't those shared standards or metrics that Jennifer was talking about. You know, where we actually have research, it's either done by academics, and I'm an academic, I love academics, but it's slow, really slow. And it often isn't applied research that can be really integrated into programming, or you have funds for programs like we're doing, and then we have to scrape together pennies to try and do the kind of impact research that you saw. So there has to be just a much more organized, concerted, larger approach and a lot less fragmentation in the field if we want to make real strides. And it's doable. It's completely doable.
Thank you, Kristin. Jennifer?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with everything Kristin just said. A couple key themes jumped out at me when I was listening to the other panelists. The first is obviously the need for research. We all talked about it. We all talked about how we just need more research on everything, and it needs to be coordinated so that we're not all running off in our own directions and doing the same thing, but with different standards or looking at different metrics. The second is the duration, like the need for long-term investments and then long-term data tracking, so that we're not just investing for now, but that we're thinking about the long term and we're tracking people over time so that we understand like what is needed to have that long-term effect, which is what we ultimately want to have. The third is this idea of diversity, and I think that's both diversity in terms of people who are studying this or trying to implement things. So whether we're talking about researchers or practitioners, platforms, government, making sure everyone is involved, but also diversity in terms of audiences and making sure that we're thinking about all the different audiences we need to reach. And then the fourth is this idea of scale. You know, there's a ton of small efforts. We, as part of our project, had a database of media literacy trainings and programs and interventions that we found online. And there were a lot of them, but they all reach really small audiences. So how do we scale that up? You know, Kristin's numbers are amazing. They're among the highest that I've seen. But still, like, there's millions of people out there. So how do we achieve scale? So those are kind of like the four themes that I see coming out of that we all talked about in various ways. And I think that the fact that we all talked about it and didn't coordinate beforehand to have those overlapping themes says something about the importance.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Claire, last thoughts from you, and then there are also a couple of questions for Kristin and others in the chat box if you're able to just throw answers in there. But Claire, would love to hear your last thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just really glad we're having this conversation. I mean, Kelly and I know, you know, there's all these convenings about misinformation for 4 years, and somebody would say media literacy, and somebody's like, no, it takes too long. We just need to get Facebook to tweak its algorithm. And there was this emphasis on we haven't got the time, the platforms can solve all of this stuff. And we just did a massive disservice to not bring the public into these conversations. So something I constantly say is that the public is absent from these conversations. Like, what kind of content do people want up or down? Like, we've just talked about misinformation in this last hour without even really clearly defining it. And one thing I'd say is when we did this qualitative study around labels, and somebody said, is it out yet? And we're about to publish it. But in that, it was a diary study, and we asked people in the wild to basically take screenshots of the things that they were seeing and talk about their feelings around labels. But what it also did was get them to reflect on this content. And at the end of it, as I was writing the research, I was just like, the thing that's amazing about this is that was probably the most innovative media literacy task, but we never designed it as that. It was meant to be research. So I think if there's a way to bring the public into these conversations about what do you want up or down, then actually we're forcing them to consider these questions of speech, misinformation, the kind of speech that we want to have or not. So I think, again, thinking innovatively about how we bring reflection into this, I think there's another part that's missing. But yeah, I'm so glad we're having this conversation. It's so necessary.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all so much for taking the time, especially with the elections coming up and how busy everyone is. I'm just greatly, greatly appreciative of that. So thank you. We will be posting this online, and so folks will be able to see that there. And with that, I will just turn quickly to next steps from the center, but really want to underscore how much I appreciate you guys showing up. And I will say that we have a couple of webinars coming up. I think there's a slide buried around here about that somewhere. One that will be next week on the digital trade wars, another the following week on Ron Diebert's new book, Reclaiming the Internet for Civil Society from Citizen Lab up in Toronto. Then we're going to have all of our team for an 1.5 hour long elections debrief the day after the election. So it will be Nate personally and Alex Stamos and Renee DiResta and Andy Grotto and Maricha Shake and the whole crew. And then on the 18th, we will be discussing antitrust and the tech platforms and some new angles we've been working on there for the last year or so that Frank Fukuyama has been leading. And then on the 10th, we will have a half-day elections debrief that will be a deeper look once we have more data. So hope folks can join for any of those. And again, thank you everyone so much for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Well,
Thank you.
bye.
Bye.
Thank you.